You are 300 meters deep, surrounded by millions of tons of salt water, pressing against the steel hull with a force of 30 kilograms per square centimeter. The air inside the compartment is cold, recycled, and carries that lingering scent of ozone and hydraulic oil that never leaves a nuclear submarine. Suddenly, a metallic snap echoes through the hull, not the normal creak of compression, but something sharp, like a steel whip snapping. Within seconds, a dense white mist begins to fill the engine room. It's not fire. It is seawater sprayed under pressure so violent that it cuts through flesh and metal like butter. The radio crackles, the power flickers, and you feel the angle of the bow begin to rise. You are sinking by the stern, and the ocean floor is 2 kilometers away. This is exactly what happened to Commander John W. Harvey on April 10, 1963, aboard the USS Thresher, SSN 593, about 350 kilometers off the coast of Cape Cod in the North Atlantic. To understand how John Harvey ended up in that nightmare of metal and pressure, we need to go back a few hours to the start of a gray Wednesday morning. Harvey was no novice. At 35, he was the epitome of the atomic-age naval officer, an Annapolis graduate, a veteran of the submarine force, and one of the trusted men of Admiral Hyman Rickover, the father of the nuclear navy. He had already served on the USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear submarine. He knew every valve, every reactor, and every safety protocol. But that morning, as he drank his bitter coffee on the bridge before submerging, there might have been a slight shadow of concern in his eyes. The Thresher was the Ferrari of the depths. It was the fastest, quietest, and deepest diving submarine in the entire United States fleet. It had just undergone a 9-month overhaul at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. It was supposed to be in peak condition. However, the ship's recent history was irritating. Minor glitches, incorrectly installed valves, electrical system issues. Things that Harvey hoped had been resolved during maintenance. Alongside the Thresher on the surface was the rescue ship USS Skylark, a small, slow vessel serving as the submarine's nanny during the tests. At 7:47 a.m., Harvey gave the order to begin the deep test dive. The procedure was standard: descend in 30-meter increments, stop, check for leaks, and continue. "Diving officer, make your depth 400 feet, Harvey commanded. His voice was calm, professional. Through the underwater communication system, the UQC underwater telephone, nicknamed Gertrude by sailors, he reported the descent to the Skylark. On board, the atmosphere was one of absolute focus. In addition to the 112 military crew members, there were 17 civilian observers and shipyard engineers, anxious to see the machine they helped build reach its operational limit. What none of them knew, as the fluorescent lights reflected off the pristine steel of the bridge, was that the Thresher's limit was not where the manual said it was, and that the ocean was merely waiting for one small, insignificant welding failure to claim the pride of American technology. Harvey looked at the depth gauge. The needle moved slowly, but steadily. The submarine was now halfway to its maximum test depth. Everything seemed normal, except for one detail Harvey would soon realize. The sound of the sea outside was changing, and the Thresher was about to enter a trap from which not even the most brilliant nuclear commander could escape. The USS Thresher was not just another submarine. It was the prototype of a new era. For Commander John Harvey, taking command of this machine was like being handed the keys to an experimental rocket. In 1963, the Thresher represented the pinnacle of the Cold War beneath the waves. It featured an HY-80 steel hull designed to withstand pressures that would have crushed any World War II-era submarine. It was so silent that Soviet sonars were useless against it. But all this innovation came at a cost: complexity. As the Thresher glided downward to a depth of 120 meters, Harvey likely recalled the preceding months at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. The ship had undergone an extensive overhaul, what sailors call a post-shakedown availability. During this period, Hundreds of systems were dismantled and reassembled. But there was one technical detail that would go unnoticed until it was too late. The Thresher had more than 3,000 piping joints bonded with silver. Unlike arc welding, silver soldering was done by brassing. If the joint wasn't perfectly clean, or if there was any impurity, it looked solid on the outside, but remained hollow and fragile on the inside. Gertrude to Skylark. Routine test. Continuing descent. Harvey's voice reported over the underwater radio. On the surface ship, operators heard the characteristic static of communication through the density of the water. Aboard the Thresher, the silence was broken only by the hum of the ventilation fans and the rhythmic clicking of the navigation instruments. Harvey was a man of details. He knew the Thresher had suffered an accidental electrical blackout while in port weeks earlier. He knew the periscope had developed leaks. But in the Navy of 1963, there was immense pressure for the pride of the fleet to be operational. The technological race against the Soviet Union allowed no delays. Admiral Rickover demanded perfection, and Harvey was determined to deliver it. He trusted his training, and above all, he trusted the S5W reactor, pulsing at the heart of the ship, providing nearly limitless power. As they passed 150 meters, the external temperature dropped drastically. The North Atlantic water, at that time of year, was near freezing. Inside the submarine, the steel hull began to sweat due to condensation. Tiny drops of icy water dripped from electrical panels, a constant reminder that they were in an inherently hostile environment. Commander Harvey moved through the attack center, observing the faces of his men. Many were young, in their 20s, proud to serve on the most advanced ship in the world. They didn't feel the danger. They felt the prestige. But Harvey, with his thousands of hours submerged, knew that the ocean is an unforgiving master. He ordered the next level, 200 meters. At this point, the external pressure was already over 20 kilograms per square centimeter. The hull, though incredibly strong, begins to compress. In a submarine, you don't hear the metal bend. You hear the adjustment. Lockers that opened easily on the surface now became stuck. The metal floor plates emitted small snaps as the ship became millimeters smaller under the weight of the water column. Harvey checked his watch. The schedule was being followed to the letter. But there was something the ultrasonic tests at the shipyard had not revealed. Of the silver brazed joints inspected at random before the ship sailed, an alarming percentage had failed the tests. However, the Navy decided the risk was acceptable. After all, they were joints in auxiliary systems, not the main pressure hull. What no one foresaw was that, in a nuclear submarine, there is no such thing as an unimportant system. Every pipe, every valve, and every drop of water under pressure is connected to the survival of everyone. As the Thresher approached the 300-meter mark, one of those joints, a small piece of metal less than 5 centimeters in diameter, hidden behind a bulkhead in the engine room, was about to give way. And when it did, Commander Harvey would discover that the Thresher had a fatal flaw in its emergency system that no one, not even the most brilliant engineers, had ever tested under real-world conditions. The clock struck 9:02. The Thresher was now at a depth of just over 300 meters. To the outside world, the North Atlantic was a desert of gray waves and biting winds. But for Commander John Harvey, the universe was contained within a steel cylinder, 85 meters long. Communication with the USS Skylark was becoming more difficult. Sound traveled erratically through the different thermal layers of the water, turning the surface radio operator's voice into a distorted, metallic whisper. Gertrude to Skylark. Maximum depth test in progress, Harvey announced. In the control center, the air was heavy with a mix of adrenaline and the artificial calm that only trained sailors can maintain. Harvey checked the gauges. They were approaching their maximum operational depth, the limit beyond which the ship had never gone since leaving the shipyard. At this moment, a submarine is like a musical instrument tuned under extreme tension. The external pressure was now approximately 300 tons per square meter. If you pressed your ear against the hull, you could hear the ocean screaming, a high-pitched sound, like sand being thrown against a wall, caused by the turbulence of the water rushing over the steel plates. Harvey gave the order for one more increment. "Diving officer, make your depth test depth." This was the critical moment. The Thresher was entering the unknown. As the ship descended, the noisy engineering of the engine room operated at full power. The S-5W reactor generated steam for the turbines, keeping the propellers turning and the submarine moving. In a deep dive, propulsion is your life. As long as you have speed, you have hydrodynamic control. The diving planes, the submarine's wings, function like those of an airplane, keeping the nose level. But hidden in the bowels of the ship, disaster was being brewed by a nearly invisible technical detail. The saltwater system, which cools critical engine components, was under the same brutal pressure as the hull. If a pipe were to burst there, the water wouldn't just leak. It would enter as a jet of plasma, capable of slicing through electrical cables and piercing human skin instantly. At 9:09, a report came from the engine room. Nothing alarming yet, just a variation in pressure. But Harvey, with his sharp instincts, felt a change in the ship's rhythm. The Thresher felt heavy. The safety protocol for an engine room leak was clear: close the isolation valves and surface. But there was a small design flaw that Harvey and his crew were about to discover the hard way. The ballast tank blow system, the mechanism that expels water and fills the tanks with compressed air to make the submarine buoyant, had never been tested at that depth. Engineers at the shipyard had installed air dryers to prevent moisture from freezing in the valves. But they hadn't accounted for the Joule-Thomson effect. When compressed air expands rapidly through a narrow valve, the temperature drops drastically. If there were any trace of moisture in the air, it would turn to ice instantly, blocking the passage. Harvey looked at the diving officer. The angle of the bow was starting to dip slightly. The ship was no longer flying through the water. It was beginning to sink. "Skylark, this is Thresher. We are experiencing minor difficulties." Harvey's voice crackled over the Gertrude at 9:12. He used the technical term minor difficulties, but his tone was that of a man trying to stay calm while the floor began to vanish. He didn't know it yet, but at that exact moment, one of the silver brazed joints in the engine room had just burst. The icy Atlantic water was now jetting into the engine compartment with the force of a cannon, hitting the main electrical panels directly. The fate of the Thresher had just been sealed by a short circuit that Commander Harvey could not yet see, but which he certainly heard when the engines went silent and the red, sinister emergency lights began to flash. At 9:13, the controlled chaos inside the Thresher's engine room reached its breaking point. When the silver brazed joint failed, the jet of water invading the compartment was no ordinary flood. It was a supersonic mist of atomized water under a pressure of 400 pounds per square inch. The noise was deafening, as if a freight train were crashing through the bulkhead. The water struck the main electrical control panels, triggering voltaic arcs that illuminated the compartment with flashes of blinding blue. In the attack control center, Commander John Harvey felt the shock even before he heard the report. The main lights flickered and died, replaced by the dim reddish glow of the emergency lights. But the most terrifying sign was what he stopped hearing: the constant hum of the reactor cooling pumps. "Scram! Scram!" The cry echoed through the loudspeakers. The Thresher's nuclear reactor, the S-5W, that was supposed to be its lifeblood, had suffered an automatic emergency shutdown. The protection systems had detected the short circuit and dropped the control rods to cease nuclear fission. In seconds, the most advanced ship in the world became a 4,000-ton steel glider without an engine, stalled more than 300 meters deep. Harvey kept his voice steady, though sweat now trickled beneath his officer's cap. "Surface, blow all main ballast tanks." This was the moment for which everyone had trained. Blowing the ballast meant releasing compressed air at 3,000 psi into the tanks, forcing the seawater out and giving the submarine the buoyancy needed to rise like a cork. The sailors cranked the steel handles with everything they had. The sound of escaping air should have been a roar of salvation, but the roar lasted only a few seconds. Suddenly, the sound of compressed air turned into a weak, high-pitched hiss until it stopped completely. The Joule-Thomson effect, which the engineers had underestimated, had just taken hold. As the air expanded rapidly, it cooled so much that residual moisture in the pipes turned into instant ice crystals. These crystals accumulated on the valve strainers, blocking the airflow. The Thresher wasn't floating. It was heavy, flooded in the engine room, and lacked the propulsion to use its diving planes. Aboard the USS Skylark on the surface, the Gertrude radio operator heard a distorted, static-filled transmission. Experiencing difficulties. Attempting to blow. Harvey's voice was calm, but the urgency was palpable. The Skylark tried to respond. "What is your condition? Do you have control of the ship?" The answer was silence. Inside the Thresher, the stern angle was increasing. Without the force of the engines to push the nose up, the weight of the water in the rear was pulling the submarine backward and downward. Harvey faced an impossible decision. He needed to restart the reactor to regain propulsion, but Navy safety protocol, dictated by the rigid Admiral Rickover, required a slow, careful process lasting several minutes to avoid a radiological disaster. "We need propulsion," Harvey must have thought, staring at the depth gauge, which now read 350 meters. 380 meters. The Thresher was descending beyond its test depth. The HEY-80 steel was being tested as never before. With every meter they sank, the ocean squeezed the hull a little harder, and the time remaining before the collapse depth, the depth where steel simply folds like paper, was shrinking by the second. Harvey looked at the reactor officer. They were alone in the dark, listening to the metal groan under a pressure that no human being was ever meant to witness. The manual said one thing, but survival demanded another. However, for the Thresher, the ocean was not interested in manuals. The needle on the depth gauge would not stop. 400 meters. 420 meters. In the attack control center, the silence was broken only by the metallic snapping of the bulkheads being compressed. Every sailor aboard the Thresher knew what those sounds meant. The ocean was searching for a weakness. Commander John Harvey was now facing a submariner sea's worst-case scenario, the pull of the abyss. Without propulsion, and with the ballast tanks blocked by ice, the submarine was a dead weight sinking toward its crushed depth. "Restart the reactor. Now!" Harvey's order must have rung out with cutting urgency. But restarting an S5W reactor isn't like turning the key in a car. It is a delicate dance of nuclear physics and thermal procedures. Under normal circumstances, the process would take time to prevent thermal shock from cracking the core components. But Harvey didn't have time. He had, perhaps, 3 minutes to live. In the engine room, the scene was a technicolor nightmare. Under the red emergency lights, men fought against the mist of icy water that continued to gush in. The smell of burnt electrical insulation and the ozone from short circuits filled their lungs. They tried desperately to drain the water, flooding the compartment. But the pumps required electricity, the very electricity the stalled reactor was failing to provide. Aboard the USS Skylark, Lieutenant James Watson listened to the underwater radio with his heart in his throat. At 9:16, he caught Harvey's voice again. The transmission was so distorted, it seemed to come from another dimension. 900 north. Negative. These were fragments of coordinates, or perhaps emergency codes. Watson grabbed the microphone and shouted, "Thresher, this is Skylark. Repeat. Are you in distress?" Inside the submarine, the external pressure was now 45 kilograms per square centimeter. The HY-80 hull, the pride of American metallurgy, was beginning to give way. It wasn't a catastrophic failure yet, but the diameter of the submarine was literally shrinking by millimeters. This caused smaller internal pipes to rupture and bolts to snap off the bulkheads, flying like projectiles. Harvey looked at the angle of inclination. The stern was too heavy. He likely tried to use the little energy remaining in the emergency batteries to move the diving planes in a desperate attempt to glide upward. Without the thrust of the propellers, the submarine simply slid backward like an airplane in a stall. Harvey's dilemma was cruel. Rickover's protocol prevented a rapid reactor restart to protect the integrity of the nuclear plant. But at that moment, protecting the reactor meant condemning 129 men to death. Based on reports of similar incidents, it is believed the engineering team attempted an emergency bypass to obtain steam, but the valves, chilled by the expanded air and seawater, may have seized. Go to 3,000 psi on the blow again. Try to break the ice. Harvey might have ordered. The sailors opened the compressed air valves once more. For a second, the roar of the air returned, but it soon turned into a high-pitched wail and stopped. The ice was impenetrable. The system that was supposed to save them had become their tomb. The depth gauge passed the red mark. The Thresher was now in territory where no submarine of its class had ever been. They had crossed the test depth and were approaching the theoretical collapse depth. Harvey knew the steel structure had an elastic limit. Once surpassed, the hull would no longer bend, it would simply implode. At 9:17, one last message reached the Skylark. It was short, fragmented, and accompanied by a sound that would haunt sonar operators for decades. Harvey said only 4 words before the static took over for good. Exceeding test depth. He didn't scream. He didn't panic. John Harvey remained an officer until the very last second, reporting the technical fact that the ocean had finally won the battle. At 9:18, the silence aboard the USS Skylark was brutally shattered. The sonar operator, with headphones pressed tightly against his temples, heard a sound that the U.S. Navy would spend months analyzing, but which any sea veteran would recognize instantly. It was a low-frequency boom, a muffled and violent thump, followed by a series of crackles resembling the sound of paper being crumpled by a giant hand. After that, there was only the white noise of the ocean. Inside the Thresher, the end was not a slow agony. When the HY-80 hull finally reached its crush depth, estimated at approximately 600 to 750 meters, the failure was not gradual. It was instantaneous. In a fraction of a second, the steel structure collapsed inward at a speed of nearly 3,000 kilometers per hour. For Commander John Harvey and the other 128 men aboard, there was no time to feel fear or pain. The physics of the depths are unforgiving. When the hull gives way at that depth, the air inside the submarine is compressed so violently that the temperature rises instantly to levels approaching those of the sun's surface due to adiabatic compression. In milliseconds, before the water could even touch them, everything flammable and human tissue itself ignited. The ocean then rushed into the vacuum with energy equivalent to several tons of TNT. The Thresher didn't just break. It was literally disintegrated from the inside out. The nuclear reactor, the propulsion turbines, and the crew quarters were transformed into a rain of metallic debris that began its silent 2-kilometer descent to the Atlantic floor. On the Skylark, Lieutenant Watson desperately tried to re-establish contact. "Thresher, this is Skylark. Do we read you?" "Over." He received no answer. The sea outside looked the same as it had 10 minutes earlier, but beneath those gray waves, the pride of the American Navy had ceased to exist. Watson looked at the Skylark's captain, Stanley Hecker. Hecker's face was pale. They knew that at that control difficulties followed by silence and an impact noise on the sonar meant only one thing. Protocol required them to keep calling. They dropped signaling grenades into the water, a signal for the submarine to surface immediately if the radio was broken. No air bubbles, no oil slick, nothing rose to the surface. The clock ticked toward 10 o'clock At 11 o'clock, aboard the Skylark, hope began to evaporate, replaced by a cold, bureaucratic horror. They had to report to Submarine Fleet Command. As encrypted messages began flying to the Pentagon and the White House, Commander John Harvey, the man trained to command the future of naval warfare, now rested in a debris field stretching for kilometers across the ocean floor. He had died as he lived, at his command post, trying to save his ship and his men from an enemy that no nuclear weapon could defeat, the physical pressure of the planet itself. The impact of the Thresher-S loss would be felt like a shockwave throughout the entire United States military structure. The world was about to discover that atomic technology was not invincible, and the Navy was about to face its most painful investigation. But for the families of the 129 men waiting at New London Harbor, the nightmare was only just beginning. Official confirmation did not come through an announcement, but through a funereal silence that stretched across the following hours. Aboard the USS Skylark, the crew continued to patrol the area where the Thresher had made its final contact, dropping smoke grenades and sonar signals in the hope of a miracle. But the ocean returned only an iridescent oil slick and a few fragments of cork used for thermal insulation, the only relics of what had once been a $45 million fortress. At 6:30 p.m. that same Wednesday, Admiral George Anderson, Chief of Naval Operations, took the podium at the Pentagon. His face was rigid. He announced to the world that the USS Thresher was presumed lost. The news hit the United States like a physical blow. In the height of the Cold War, losing a nuclear submarine and its entire crew was not just a human tragedy. It was a national security disaster. The Navy acted quickly, but the task was Herculean. The ocean floor in that region, known as the continental slope, is an alien terrain of canyons and abyssal mud at a depth of 2,600 meters. To find the Thresher, the Navy summoned the Trieste, an experimental bathyscaphe that was the only vehicle in the world capable of descending to such depths. What the Trieste's cameras and side-scan sonars revealed months later was a scene of absolute devastation. The Thresher was not intact. It had been shredded into 5 main sections. The tail, with its massive fins and propeller, was buried in the mud. The bow section lay hundreds of meters away. Between them was a kilometers-long trail of debris, sailors' shoes, intact coffee cups, pieces of copper piping, and what remained of the nuclear reactors. Commander John Harvey and his 128 companions had become part of the abyssal landscape. The investigation, led by a Navy Board of Inquiry, began to piece the puzzle together. They listened to the Skylark's sonar recordings repeatedly. They analyzed every maintenance record from the Portsmouth shipyard. And it was then that the truth began to emerge from the shadows of military bureaucracy. The investigation discovered that 14% of the silver-brazed joints ultrasonically tested on the USS Thresher had critical flaws. Even more shocking, the emergency blow system, Harvey's last resort, had never been tested under actual depth pressure. Engineers had assumed the compressed air would pass through the pipes without issue, ignoring the basic laws of thermodynamics that caused the deadly freezing. Witnesses reported that during the overhaul, the atmosphere at the shipyard was one of constant haste. The Thresher was the poster child of Rickover's Navy, and every day it sat idle was seen as a defeat in the race against the Russians. The pressure for results had created a culture where small defects were ignored in the name of the schedule. John Harvey, a man of iron discipline, followed the rules until the end. The problem was that the rules were written by men who never imagined what happens when ice jams your valves and the atom goes silent 400 meters deep. The inquiry was about to change the Navy forever, but for the orphans and widows on shore, the technical answers were cold comfort in the face of the abyss that now existed in their lives. Commander John Harvey and his crew's sacrifice was not in vain, but the price of the lesson was written in the blood of 129 men. The U.S. Navy realized, in a traumatic fashion, that its technology had outpaced its safety measures. The USS Thresher was too complex, too fast, and dived too deep for construction standards inherited from World War II. The response to this crisis of confidence was the creation of one of the most rigorous safety protocols in military history, a SubSafe program. If you were to step onto a submarine today, you would see Harvey's legacy in every inch of metal. Before the Thresher, the documentation for each component was precarious. After it, every valve, every bolt, and every weld joint on a nuclear submarine began to have a birth certificate. Today, the Navy knows exactly who cast the steel, who inspected the weld, and who installed the part. The SubSafe program imposed an absolute rule. If a critical system cannot be verified and documented with 100% certainty, the submarine does not submerge. The failure of the Thresher's silver brazed joints changed how hulls are assembled. Brazing was replaced by full arc welding, which is far stronger and more verifiable. But the most profound change occurred in the emergency blow system. The technical error that froze Harvey's valves was corrected with larger diameter, piping, and redundant dehumidification systems. Today, a submarine can blow its tanks at any depth without the risk of creating an ice plug. Admiral Hyman Rickover, the man who shaped Harvey's career, was harshly questioned during the investigations. Although he defended the safety of his reactors, and indeed, the Thresher as reactor remained intact until the hull imploded, he had to accept that the shipyard culture of haste required a radical overhaul. The Navy learned that technological arrogance is the most dangerous enemy in the depths. Since the implementation of SubSafe in 1963, the United States has lost only one other submarine, the USS Scorpion, in 1968. However, the Scorpion was not SubSafe certified. Among ships that hold the certification, the rate of catastrophic loss is 0. The Thresher became the invisible guardian of every submariner who came after. The Navy also changed how it trains its commanders. Harvey S. dilemma restarting the reactor quickly or following the slow protocol while sinking has been exhaustively analyzed in simulators. Today, officers are trained in fast recovery procedures, ensuring that propulsion is never lost long enough for the ocean to take control. The debris field at a depth of 2,600 meters remains a sanctuary. The Navy conducts periodic inspections of the site to monitor radiation levels, which remain normal, and to pay their respects. The crushed wreckage of the Thresher is a physical reminder that beneath the waves, there is no margin for error. John Harvey and his crew tested the limits of human engineering, and in their failure, they assured that thousands of others would make it home safely. More than 60 years have passed since the USS Thresher disappeared into the icy waters of the North Atlantic, but the shadow of its sail still looms over every submarine that leaves port today. Commander John Harvey and his 128 men are not just names on a casualty list. They became the foundation upon which modern naval safety was built. In 2019, a permanent memorial was finally dedicated at Arlington National Cemetery to the men of the Thresher. But the true monument is not made of stone or bronze. It is made of protocols, structural integrity, and the culture of safety that permeates the submarine force. When a young sailor today triple-checks a hull valve, or when an engineer demands a new ultrasonic test on a weld, they are honoring Harvey's sacrifice. The contrast between the era of the Thresher and the present day is stark. In 1963, Harvey was operating at the very edges of human understanding regarding hydrodynamics and material strength under extreme pressure. Today, we possess digital sensors, computer modeling, and underwater rescue systems that the captain of the Thresher could never have imagined. Yet, the ocean remains the same, an indifferent force that does not forgive complacency. The Thresher incident taught us that the pursuit of technological progress must never override humility in the face of nature. The tragedy transformed the United States Navy from an organization that learned through blood into one that prevents through rigor. The SubSafe program remains the gold standard of safety engineering in the world. influencing even the aerospace and civil nuclear industries. John W. Harvey was a man of duty. If he could see today's fleet, knowing that no subsafe certified submarine has ever been lost, he would likely feel that his final terrible mission was accomplished. He and his crew remain on their eternal patrol, resting where sunlight never reaches, yet serving as beacons for all those who choose the depths as their battlefield. The story of the USS Thresher is a reminder that behind every great human advancement, there are real men and women who faced the unknown. They accepted the risk so that we could learn the way. If you have made it this far, you now know the weight that every submarine carries beneath its hull. Did you enjoy this historical immersion? If so, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos on the events that shaped our world. Like the video so this story reaches more people. And leave a comment honoring these heroes. Do you believe the tragedy was preventable? Or was it the inevitable price of technological progress during the Cold War?